We are with Mckenzie Wark in New York City. She's professor of media and culture and author of many books, among them A Hacker Manifesto, Molecular Red, The Theory of the Anthropocene, and recently Capital is Dead and Sensoria, Thinkers of the 21st Century. I want to begin with an essay that we translated from Architecture to Kinotecture. You propose that we are going from an architecture of things that we know how will happen to an architecture of the accident. But how do you explain that in this moment of after the pandemic? Has that changed, or it's even worse, this condition of architecture having to respond to the accident, the accidental?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask what where is the arche in architecture, given that it means a lot of things. It means the foundation and the root and the order. And well, what if the world doesn't have those things? Like there's a way in which architecture always presupposes certain constants that you can, reliably build within, even if everything else that you're building for is kind of change. Yeah. Well, what if that's not there? Like, what is the building of the accident? And I was trying to sort of reverse what Paul Virilio was doing famously throughout his whole career, but in bunker archaeology in particular. There's a way in which he talks about the bunkering of the Third Reich as a part of a whole spatial ontology of Nazism. And how it was overwhelmed. But it's like curious to me that, and he's doing this from the point of view of having lived through it as a child, of having been there. But I was curious about the built form that actually won. So like I called it a kinotecture rather than an architecture of the built form that made it possible to invade Normandy. And that was, artificial floating harbors and a whole astonishing research done by J.D. Bernal and others as to how you could get tanks up a beach. Like what was the grain of sand? What was the grade of the beach? They had to figure all this stuff out without knowing it. And it struck me that is a sort of better analogy for what building might be like in an era of climate instability than what we traditionally thought of as architecture.
And in that respect, do you think that, well, you have written about from the Hacker Manifesto to Capital is Dead, from the hacker class, the class that produces content and information, to the vectorialist class, that is the class that ruling the way this content is transmitted. And also we have now with the pandemic, the essential workers. So do you think that in a way, the lockdown, the way the streets are being arranged to have more people out in the street, or the Zoom meetings are in a way responding to this kind of new architecture of the accident?
Well, we'd have to wind back a little bit and think about one of the things the war spawned is information technology. There's a way in which the sort of really crucial breakthroughs all happen in the 40s or immediately afterwards. So we sort of tend to focus on the tanks and planes and all that big stuff I was talking about. But how do you, organize and control that? To what extent was even weather weaponized during the war, in the sense that the Allies timed the Normandy invasion based on two separate weather forecasts, one of which showed that there would be a storm that would end by the time the troops emerged out of it. So there's ways in which science and information technology in particular were kind of being weaponized during the war that I think creates a new kind of ruling class by our time. That I called it the vectoralist class, who are controlling the information vector and managing the whole value chain through that. And then that produces, on top of the existing subordinate classes of farmers and workers, what I call hacker class, which you can think of as digital labor versus analog labor. Yeah. And then we can think now about the pandemic as, firstly, a thing, if it's solvable at all, is solvable through a massive, sort of application of information-based science. It's kind of, we have all of these teams trying to figure out a virus at the moment. All of the sciences are now kind of computational at their root, in terms of how they're organized, how they model and so forth. But then you start to notice various things about how the world is organized in these extraordinary circumstances. And this is a lesson from Virilio. It's the accident, sort of shows you the form that you're working inside already. One of which is that some of our work is actually not terribly useful at all, but you can safely do it, as in my case, I can teach from home. But the essential labor holding the world together is precarious, dangerous, and now under increased danger in hospitals and through logistics, right? Like it's the supply chain workers and then the service workers who are essential to keeping, this whole thing functioning, from the farmer in the field exposed to corona because of the living conditions that they're forced into, through meat processing plants and food processing plants, through to people who stack shelves and work cash registers and all that sort of stuff, not to mention essential services and health and fire and things like that. So I think we're sort of exposing through this, and of course the pandemic's not really an accident, these things happen periodically, but the change in circumstances exposes the built form and our relation to it.
And in that sense, amongst the worst, or one of the worst economic crises in decades, the market value of, I don't know, Amazon or Apple is going way up. And at the same time, we have social protests in many countries. So do you think this is, in a way, is a gap or a breaking between vectorialist and hacker class in this digital world and the real world coming up to reclaim their place or something?
Well, the thing about the control of the value chains for information is it's all completely real. The infrastructure it runs on is, will be the ruins that our civilization is known for. Yeah, these server farms around the world are consuming enough power to run a medium-sized country. It's not virtual at all. It's like incredibly real. And there's a kind of, the thing is that the infrastructure is mostly invisible, or we don't pay attention to it, or it's kind of ugly, so you don't sort of notice it's there. Yeah. In New York City, you can see where the cables go because there's spray paint on the sidewalk that shows you who's cabled under it, and it's coded by color. So you kind of go, yeah, I can tell, like this is that particular internet backbone is running down this particular street and so on. So it's all very real. But maybe what we're seeing, and stock market valuation doesn't have a lot to do with the real economy, but it's maybe tracking a belief that the crisis will see a consolidation of power in the hands of a handful of monopolists whose strategies are monopolistic, attempting to kind of control all of the value chain through the control of information. And your Apple, Google, or Amazon or whatever are particularly well poised to do that, because that's exactly what they do.
And one last question, you wrote in Molecular Red a phrase that struck me a lot. You say, the unspeakable secret about climate change is that nobody really wants to think about it for too long. We had, I don't know, social protests around the world, in Chile and in Europe, Extinction Rebellion also around the world, or the Women March around the world just before the pandemic. Do you think that we are going to go back to speak about those themes long enough, or are we going, or the pandemic is a way, it's not a conspiracy theory, but to go away from these problems and focus in another thing?
Yeah, we don't have an information system that's really very well designed to pay attention to anything for too long. The news cycle doesn't work that way. It looked like cyclone was going to hit the Gulf Coast here, and it looks like it's a bit of a near miss. Obviously, a lot of people's lives were destroyed and homes were destroyed and that sort of thing. But nobody sort of quite notices that these get incrementally worse every year. That sort of parts of Louisiana are really, that are on the map aren't really there anymore. It's like it's underwater, but you can't redraw the map because property is property. So there's a sense that it's very, very hard to pay attention to these things that happen incrementally and then suddenly in the form of a disaster that seems unique and separate. So it's very, very difficult. And obviously the window is closed to anything but remediate climate change. So from an architectural point of view, it's like, what do you build that's temporary, adaptable? That's to do with, what's an architecture of moving millions of people away from the coast? Those are, I don't think it's even architecture anymore. Let's call it kinotecture, the architecture of a crisis, if you like. But maybe even crisis is not a useful word. But then in that context, it's interesting that, and I can only speak about the United States, this kind of massive protest against mass incarceration and the over-policing of our lives and its impact particularly on Black lives, And connecting these things together is the challenge, though. To what extent is a doubling down on policing and incarceration a kind of mega fascist strategy that we'll see rolled out worldwide as the architectural solution? Yeah, the architectural solution is mass surveillance, police on the streets, mass incarceration. Like we're already seeing that. And of course, walls, walls is the other thing that's being built everywhere. There's a lot of focus in the United States on the wall with Mexico. I actually think a lot of Americans are going to be trying to flee to Canada over that border in the coming century, which is both a joke and not a joke, right? Europe has even bigger walls around it than the ones Trump was proposing that we never talk about. So to what extent is that the kind of structure that we're actually sort of looking at right now as what built form became, as a way of kind of policing your way through essentially the end of a civilization? But in the ruins of that, we get to build a new one. Yeah, like what does it mean to build something else in the ruins of everything, including ruins of the climate?
I said that it was a last question, but I have a new question with that what you said regarding the social movements, the protest in the street, and this idea that you have written about, especially, well, I read it in Capitalist Debt, about vulgarity. Is this an answer or the question of populism as a bad way of speaking of popular movements against vulgarity as a way of reclaiming the power from the bottom, as you have spoken about? Are we living in this moment a new power from bottom up?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I hadn't really thought of that, the tension between populism and the idea of the vulgar. And I was sort of trying to re-articulate the lost thread of a vulgar Marxism in particular, that's interested in the forces of production, that's interested in everyday life in its kind of ordinariness and kind of embodied messiness. How do we follow those threads a little bit? So I think there's a tendency, and it's sort of shared by people who do theory and people who do architecture. Yeah, there's a lot about the messy stuff. Like, how many architects really want to think about the plumbing? But from a real point of view, that's the sort of central thing about built forms we live in, right? Is the plumbing. Like, where does the waste go? Like, the most vulgar thing about it is the thing that's just like, just sort of like put it on the plan and don't think about it again, So, like, and it's kind of like, you see so many beautifully rendered, kind of built forms. There aren't even any people in it, let alone any dirt. Like nobody is kind of, like, I'm particularly interested in like nightclub architecture, and you're kind of like, yeah, that's really pretty, but do you know what people actually do in bathrooms and nightclubs? Like, where's the picture of that? So it's kind of like in both the theory world and the architecture world to think about the vulgar side of it. And vulgar just means common and popular. Like it has a range of meanings. And it's a Latin root, so it's probably common to some of our languages as well, one way or another. So yeah, to sort of think that, and to think that those material needs of bodies are like directly connected to a kinotexture for enduring climate disruption. Yeah. Because that's the most basic stuff you have to do. Like, so that's what a camp does. Yeah, there's really interesting architectural research on what the camp form is, and it meets the most basic needs, like shelter and somewhere to do, to put waste. That's it. How do we do that for multiple millions, possibly billions of people? Like, we don't even know.